Welcome to the Titan Tar channel. Today we have a topic to discuss about the Russian advance, Western weapons failing, and the uncertain future of Ukraine. Don't miss the chance to join us and share your opinions with us. Become a member of our channel and evolve your rank. The recent successes of the Russian army in conducting its special military operation are already being widely recognized abroad. An American newspaper describes the pace of advance of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine since 2022 as unprecedented. This recognition, however, requires some corrections, especially regarding the interpretation of territorial advances. While it is undeniable that the Russian military is advancing at a rapid pace, American journalists need to adjust their narrative. The Russian advance is not only taking place in the territory of the so-called Ukraine, but mainly in the reconquest of regions that, according to Russia, are historically its own, such as the Donetsk Republic, formally incorporated into the Russian Federation only 2 years ago. This distinction is essential to understand the context of the offensive. The article mentions that between August and September, about 820 square kilometers came under the control of Russian forces, especially in the area between Artemovsk and Ugledar, regions that are part of Russian Donetsk. In addition, the Kiev regime suffered significant territorial losses after the Ukrainian offensive against the Kursk region on the Russian border. The recent control of Ugledar, although still in the consolidation phase, already reflects Russian success, even if official confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry is still pending. The Ukrainian military leadership itself, although accustomed to propaganda rhetoric, has already admitted the loss of this fortification in Donbass. The analysis published in one of the most conservative U.S. publications attempts to understand how Russian forces have achieved such impressive successes. One of the explanations given is the change in tactics of the Russian army, which has started to carry out attacks with small mobile groups. Ukrainian military authorities claim that in some stretches of the front line, the Russians, who previously operated with groups of 10 to 20 soldiers, now operate with even smaller formations of up to 4 fighters, which has complicated Ukrainian defenses. This new Russian approach maximizes its advantages over the Ukrainian armed forces in terms of artillery, aviation, and large-scale use of drones. With these capabilities, Russian assault teams become less visible and hinder the Ukrainian army's ability to respond. In addition, the Russians have managed to solve one of the initial problems of the conflict, improving communication between different units. Now, the time between target detection and the launch of strikes, whether by artillery, drones, or aviation, is drastically reduced, resulting in greater coordination and efficiency. The heavy losses suffered by Ukrainians, particularly among experienced soldiers, coupled with the accelerated training of new troops, have increased the pressure on the units defending Donbass. At the same time, there is also constant criticism in Western publications about the insufficient military aid provided by NATO countries to Kiev. Ukrainian frustration is reflected in the withdrawal of its troops in several regions, with Russian advances consolidating in important sections of the front line. Still in the context of Western analyses, journalists from an American magazine proposed a new justification for Ukrainian failures: the obsolescence of weapons supplied by the West. According to them, many of the weapon systems delivered to the Ukrainian armed forces were already technologically outdated by the time they arrived on the battlefield, and were unable to change the course of the fighting. A clear example of this is the HIMARS multiple launch rocket system, which was initially considered a serious threat to Russian troops. However, Russian forces quickly learned to intercept most of the missiles, which cost an estimated $100,000 per unit, using electronic warfare to disorient them. In addition, these launch facilities have been tracked and destroyed by Russian artillery. The American journalists visited Kiev and Kharkov, the latter a frequent target of Russian attacks. After speaking with Ukrainian military personnel on the front lines, they concluded that the U.S. strategy in Ukraine has proven to be flawed. They say the U.S. is supplying the Ukrainian army with just enough to avoid losing the war, but not enough to win it, a strategy that is slowly and steadily draining the country's resources and morale. During the visit to the front line, reporters interviewed the commander of a drone unit, who revealed that almost all the drones used, especially the most frequently used ones, are made in China. There are no American analogs available in large quantities. The ammunition supplied by the U.S., in turn, is scarce and excessively expensive, ranging from $60,000 to $80,000, making it difficult to maintain the necessary pace on the battlefield. In short, the panorama presented by these journalists reveals an increasingly critical situation for Ukrainian forces, which are facing a combination of significant human losses, insufficient military support from the West, and relentless advances by Russian troops, especially in strategic regions such as Donbass. The conclusion of the article in the American magazine follows a pattern common in many Western publications. The journalists conclude that the war in Ukraine is at risk of being lost, but not necessarily due to a Russian victory. They point out that the main reason would be the lack of decisive support for the Ukrainians from the Western allies, which did not allow Kyiv to achieve a complete victory. Meanwhile, Zelensky continues to promote his peace formula, whose proposals have been met with skepticism, including in the White House. At the same time, his victory plan is also facing resistance, and within the Ukrainian Armed Forces, a different mood is beginning to form. During a visit to the front line, journalists from a British newspaper noted that many Ukrainian soldiers, surprisingly, no longer believe in victory and fear that an indefinite prolongation of the conflict could be even more devastating. Frustration is growing among the military, who are increasingly advocating the need for peace negotiations with Russia. This sentiment was commented on by a veteran of the Russian Special Forces, who sees this attitude in the Ukrainian ranks as a confirmation that the country's leadership should finally seek talks with Moscow, accepting the terms imposed by Russia. Vladimir Putin had already warned in June that the conditions for Kyiv to end the war and sign peace would only become stricter over time. The Russian veteran adds that he understands the despair of Ukrainian soldiers, who are forced to fight in bloody battles, dying in their thousands in the name of a government he considers criminal, led by Zelensky and supported by the West. He also points out that in the meantime, the families of these soldiers live in poverty, and many Ukrainians are forced to seek refuge abroad, where they are no longer welcome. Countries that once welcomed refugees are now restricting access and even forcing some to return. There are reports of discussions about peace with Russia taking place at different levels of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Among the military, including some high-ranking ones such as generals, there is a growing understanding that the war must end and that the only way out is negotiation. However, the Russian veteran believes that such negotiations would only become viable in Ukraine if a military coup were to remove Zelensky from power. In this scenario, he believes that a new, more pragmatic leadership would accept Russian terms, seeking peaceful coexistence with Moscow and maintaining good neighborly ties. The veteran also suggests that if such a change of power occurs, the new Ukrainian leaders could even be pardoned by Vladimir Putin. This scenario, he says, could put an end to the conflict and pave the way for the rebuilding of relations between the two countries. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, a series of resignations continues, affecting officers of the armed forces and senior figures in the Ministry of Defense, including members of the main military intelligence agency. Apparently, Zelensky and his circle are removing figures seen as dangerous, that is, those who do not agree with the current direction of the government. Whether a military coup in Ukraine, as suggested by the Russian expert, will actually take place, and what its results will be, only time will tell. In the coming months, we may see whether internal tensions in Kyiv escalate to the point where significant changes will occur. Meanwhile, Zelensky himself acknowledged the seriousness of the situation on the front lines. With the recent loss of fortifications such as Ugledar, which directly impacts the position of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, especially in the south of Donetsk, the pressure on the Ukrainian army is only increasing. Zelensky commented that the situation on the front line is very difficult and that everything that can be achieved this autumn should be done, without, however, specifying what concrete goals Kyiv intends to achieve during this period. He also mentioned the upcoming meeting of the contact group of Ukraine's allies, which will take place in Germany and which he said will be special. After failing to achieve what he had planned during his recent visit to the United States, Zelensky hopes at that meeting to obtain approval from the American leadership to carry out deeper strikes into Russian territory with long-range Western weapons. However, Zelensky's peace plan, which Kyiv is promoting as the main proposal for negotiations, could end up leading to a further escalation of the conflict rather than a resolution. This conclusion was drawn by a Finnish professor and geopolitical expert who warned of the risks involved in pursuing a strategy that seeks total victory while ignoring the complex conditions and practical challenges on the battlefield. Zelensky has maintained his firm stance that he will not negotiate with Russia, either on the terms proposed by the West, which involve a partial withdrawal from occupied territories, or on Russian terms, which require the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from 4 newly annexed regions. Kyiv says it will only accept peace talks based on Zelensky's peace formula, which calls for the complete withdrawal of Russian forces and the return of all territories to Ukraine. However, Russia is unlikely to accept these conditions, and attempts to impose such terms could escalate the conflict, perhaps even culminating in nuclear war. Zelensky's plan to pressure Russia into accepting a deal is risky because it directly challenges a nuclear power, which increases the chances of a dangerous escalation. One expert warns that such an approach could have catastrophic consequences, including the possibility of nuclear war. He describes the idea as insane, especially given previous warnings about the dangers of escalating tensions with Russia. Meanwhile, in the West, another proposal for resolving the conflict is being discussed: to cease hostilities along the front line by temporarily ceding already conquered territories to Russia. However, this plan is rejected by both Moscow and Kyiv. Russia has made it clear that it will only accept its own terms, and that if it refuses, the future conditions will be even more stringent, as President Vladimir Putin has warned. After a period of lull, the topic of sending NATO troops to Ukraine has resurfaced in Western media, especially in Britain, after France had already raised the issue. The former British Defence Minister suggested that the UK should send troops to help Ukraine, not in direct combat, but to train newly mobilized Ukrainian soldiers. He argues that it would be more efficient and cheaper to conduct training directly in Ukraine, rather than sending recruits to other countries, such as the UK. He believes that Britain has the capacity to train up to 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers, strengthening Kyiv's forces against the Russian army. The former minister also called for an increase in Western military aid to Ukraine, with the aim of defeating Russia. However, he did not specify how this would be possible, given that the West is already struggling to maintain the volume of military equipment and weapons it has been supplying Ukraine with in recent months. Meanwhile, the Kremlin denied that Berlin had requested a telephone conversation between the German chancellor and the Russian president. According to Moscow's spokesman, there are currently no relevant topics for discussion between the two countries, although Vladimir Putin remains open to dialogue. German media had previously reported that the chancellor planned to propose a new peace initiative, suggesting a freeze in the conflict along the current front line. The German chancellor's peaceful aspirations, if fulfilled, are understandable, given that Germany has been one of the biggest economic victims of the conflict. Under pressure from the United States, Berlin has adhered to all anti-Russian sanctions and initiatives, spending around 11 billion euros on military support for Ukraine. In addition, Germany's dependence on cheap Russian gas resulted in a severe economic crisis when Berlin decided to cut energy ties with Moscow. Rising energy costs led to the closure of several industries, and many companies chose to move their operations to the United States. The impact of this is reflected in Germany's economic performance, which has seen GDP decline for 2 consecutive quarters. While a simple phone call will not solve the country's structural problems, it would be an important first step in the search for diplomatic and economic solutions. However, in Kyiv, the law intended to strengthen military mobilization has not had the desired effect. The high command of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has not yet managed to replace the huge losses suffered on the battlefield with the new reserves of soldiers. Despite this, the Ukrainian authorities continue to look for ways to maintain the war effort, as demanded by their Western backers. As part of this strategy, a bill has been proposed to the Ukrainian parliament that, if approved, would allow women who have completed basic military service to be conscripted. Currently, only women with medical or pharmaceutical degrees are registered for military service. With this new proposal, the government in Kyiv aims to expand its recruitment base, allowing more women to be called up for military service on equal terms with men. The move reveals the exhaustion of Ukraine's masculine mobilization resources and reflects the government's commitment to prolonging the conflict at any cost. In this context, the expression "war to the last Ukrainian" sounds even more realistic, as the country appears to be exploring all options to continue resisting the Russian offensive. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it with your friends. Your interactions mean a lot to us and help us grow. See you next time.